And welcome back to our panel discussion, The Catalyst for the Government's Big Data Revolution, sponsored by NetApp and CDWG right here on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. Once again, our guests today are John Montell, the Electronic Records Manager in the Office of the CIO at the Interior Department, Terry Halverson, the CIO of the Department of the Navy, David Bray, the CIO of the Federal Communications Commission, Jack Nichols, Solutions Architect at CDWG, and Lee Vorthman, the Chief Technology Officer for Federal Civilian Agencies at NetApp U.S. Public Sector. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And I guess we've talked about mobility, we've talked about applications, but it would be hard to talk about big data and the revolution in big data without talking about the other revolution which hosts so much of this, and that is the cloud idea. And I would say that at this point in history, the cloud revolution for government is about where the data center consolidation is, maybe third gear in a six-gear system here. So, David Bray, let's start with you on cloud. Where is the FCC standing? Where do you want to head? And how are you organizing and repositioning data and virtualization to support cloud?
So cloud is central to our strategy. Actually, I would love to have the ability to say 2.5 years from now that we actually don't host anything at the FCC, that actually everything is actually commercially hosted. And that's just sort of, is again, fitting that we're a small commission. With that, to that steps, there's also to tie into virtualization. And we are literally rolling out this month and over the next 3 months, virtual desktop to all our users. And so that'll get them, and that'll help us both with virtualization so they then can go take the next steps to the cloud. And we're also looking
virtual user as opposed to virtual server.
Virtual user, looking at bring your own device, actually allowing that to be used in the field, and actually the things that we can go from there. Get the virtual user, and then behind the scenes, and it doesn't really matter where we're actually storing the data that they're then hitting with that device. And so that can then allow us to make the virtualization on that side and go to cloud. The advantage, I guess, that our applications are so old, we can literally leapfrog straight to the cloud. And so all new development, the data mart that we talked about, would actually be stored in the cloud. And with that strategy, too, is the fact that the FCC, for whatever reason, has more than 95,000 different data elements for a commission of only 1,750 people. And part of that will be, and I think the comments were said earlier, is can we identify overlapping data or cases where we've called first name 207 different times a different field or a different way of actually sort of bringing it together? I think our key strategy is recognizing the FCC that our real value is in the persistence and the permanence of our data. Applications will come and go, and particularly when we look at mobile, I mean, the average app of a mobile app is less than 5 months. And so we're looking at that things will come and go on the UI space, but we really want to make that data available as much as possible to our partners, the public, as well as ourselves.
So you're really doing 4 things at once here.
Have to, because our goal is actually in 18 months or less to have some of the best IT in government, and we're probably starting from 15 years behind, so it is going to be an interesting next year and a half.
That might make it easier in some sense.
Yes.
Because you can throw it all out.
It at least gives us a burning platform.
Right. And John, of course, Interior is a cloud provider in some sense to the government, but you're also a user of these services, so what's going on there?
So we have the cloud hosting foundation contract. And initially, before that, we had moved the records and information management system into that. We're looking at VTL, which is very big on our plate, to virtualize our tape libraries, get those into the cloud
Virtual
first.
Tape libraries.
Yeah. And quickly move to geospatial as well, which is as you know, USGS, for instance, produces over 50,000 maps, and getting those off and getting them into the cloud and sharing that data and opening that up to our partners is large on our list. But there are many facets to that. There are also other applications that are in our strategic plan, but we have to look at those very carefully. I think going back to some of our initial comments on what do we need to put out in the cloud and what's the bona fide need for that, and how do we share that with the public and with our partners inside the Department of the Interior is something that we're doing on a case-by-case basis. So I think it's a long-term strategy, but one that we're pushing as hard as we can with all the challenges ahead of us. And I think a lot of pieces around that also go to change management and trying to understand, what are the changes that need to take place, not only policy, planning, and management of those applications to the cloud.
I want to focus on maps for just a moment because partly because almost every application these days seems to have a geospatial element, and so everybody's using maps in one form or another. But do you virtualize all this map data before you cloudify it?
I'm not quite sure you need to anymore. I think that most of these things are available, on the internet or open source. The question is, what data do you need to allocate that? So if I have coordinates, for instance, that I can simply go out to a Google Maps or a Google site or a mapping site that's out on the public sector through my cloud, then I don't need to represent that inside my environment and pay for that storage or virtualize that environment to my end users. And so trying to understand what that need is and how do you project that in the fastest way possible to your employees is something that we're working on right now.
All right, Lee, I wanted to ask you, is there, from your view, a kind of standard best practice order of events in order to get data optimized? I think, the idea of maybe silo, then virtual, then cloud. I mean, what is the best way to do that? And can it apply regardless of the legacy situation that an agency might have?
Yeah, I think it can. There's certainly some things to consider, right? Is that, we've heard from, from David, and he has a lot of legacy apps, and traditionally when you have legacy apps, it's actually usually very difficult to move those to the cloud because the older legacy applications might not be supported or might not function very well in that type of shared environment. But there is a natural, I think, logical progression as you start talking about modernizing your IT infrastructure where, the first thing you look at for cost savings or just economic efficiencies is, okay, let's virtualize a bunch of this stuff and take advantage of these compute pools. And then once you get there, you realize these shared, savings effect. And then you say, well, what can we do with this? And as David mentioned in the beginning, right, you start shifting towards becoming an IT broker, whether internally or externally. And that kind of naturally leads itself to, okay, what can we now move into the cloud, whether it's public or hybrid, or private, if you will. And so I think that trend is it's just a maturity of the organization as they look to modernize. And that's something that we've certainly been looking at as well. There is one thing I'd like to highlight on, which is something that Terry mentioned, which is something that John mentioned, which is issues with moving to the cloud, right? So as you look at what you can actually move into the cloud, whether the applications or the data, there are some issues, right? So you have security issues. Clearly, who's going to access that data because now it is more prolific out there.
Everybody nodding their heads on that one.
Yeah, so certainly security is a big one. The other thing which is closely tied to security is control, right? So if you're talking about moving to a public cloud provider and you're looking at putting your mission critical data or your mission critical application into the cloud, you may actually be giving up control of your data, right? You no longer control the disaster recovery, the replication, the backup cycles. And so something we've been working very closely with our customers is how can you maintain control of your data while still taking advantage of the economic efficiencies of the cloud? And then the last thing I'd like to highlight with issues with the cloud, which is something our customers need to consider, is what's the cost of change, right? So if you're looking, if we think back to that progression of the siloed to virtualized to the cloud, what's the cost of actually modernizing that legacy application and putting it into the cloud? And then what's the cost if you choose that cloud is no longer economic? What's the cost of getting that data out, right? There's costs with change associated with it. And it's important that you consider that as part of the overall cost of the solution.
And I guess in the cloud, you have to make sure you get all of it out if you switch and all of the instances of it.
Yeah, that's certainly one thing you need to consider. The other thing we're seeing becoming a trend as our customers look to move to the cloud is kind of hedging their bets, if you will. So they look at what's the best way to, as Terry said, we want our data to be portable. We want to think of the uses of our data. So how can we make sure that our data could be very, very portable in terms of, let's say one day Amazon is a better price, and then the next day, Azure or something else is a better price. How can we take advantage of those economic, cost changes while still having our data in the cloud? And that's a big issue going on right now.
Does it matter what the architecture or composition of the cloud is? I mean, we keep using the word cloud, but for this question, let's consider a cloud somebody else's data center.
Yeah.
And so if you were talking about your own data centers and optimizing them in a way to have the right storage tiers and so forth to serve up data fast, but yet cheaply store the unused or not so often used data, how do you get that same architecture and response from a cloud, which could have a completely different makeup than what you have locally?
You'll see what's emerging is, for example, you have Amazon S3, you have Glacier, you have Microsoft Azure, right? These all have different technologies. Some are object-oriented, some are designed to be very, very long-term and cheap archives, and some are designed to give you more performance, right? And so I think what you'll find is the underlying infrastructure is probably the same, but there's technological nuances which has given those providers stickiness, if you will, right? They're providing a service and they've tried to decide the best way to provide that service. And so those kind of different nuances are what make it you have to consider what is my format, is my data being stored, and how am I going to best serve this up? And there can be tremendous differences between those.
All right, and Terry Halverson, you're nodding your head at that. It looks like you've looked into that whole idea of what actually are you getting from a cloud provider, regardless of the brand.
Yeah, so I think the first thing that somebody made a good point on, we spend a lot of times, I think, sometimes saying, technologically, what can you put in the cloud? Wrong question. What should you put in the cloud is a much better question to ask.
You can put everything if you want.
You could,
but
right.
it may not be.
And what versions of the cloud? I mean, I don't particularly like the word cloud, and cloud is just another form of a distributed data storage system. I think you're going to see more hybrid sets of answers. We will certainly, from the dawn, use more hybrid sets of answers. That gets to the other point. Security, obviously, for the Department of Navy, Department of Defense, security is a higher priority for much of our data. We're not going to put completely mission-critical data in a cloud where I don't have the control of the data. We're just not going to do that. So we'll look at the different hybrids of clouds, and we talked about that in the segment one. Same with our data centers. We'll have everything from a cloud that we own that's probably operated internal to the government, in our case probably DISA, we will use some of that, to where we actually do put. I mean, we were one of the first big agencies to go to the Amazon public cloud. We have a contract with them. It's public-facing data. It is not mission-critical data. It's data that we want the public to see. We're working hard right now with DISA, DoD, CIO to get, in FedRAMP terms, level 3 to 5, that sensitive but not classified data. We're working to get that approved for cloud storage using a commercial vendor. That will get into where we do private clouds, semi-private clouds, almost private clouds. Pick your option there. While cloud has the potential to improve your security posture, as has been pointed out, it also has the potential to increase your security problems. And I think that's the other area we have to spend some time in, because the cloud technologies are a little newer. What are the understanding about the security environment? I mean, in a simple sense, you could say once you got into cloud, if it's not configured right, your data is more exposed. There's all kinds of ways to configure it so that doesn't happen. That drives cost. It can drive some access time. And the other thing that we can't forget within the Department of Navy, because of our size, there's a bandwidth issue here too. I mean, one of the reasons that we will use more traditional solutions and park our data closer is then I'm not having to go out and use commercial or long-haul bandwidth. And we're running the amount of volume of data that we run. I run very close in many cases to the maximum pieces that my bandwidth can handle. I'm running at saturation points in some places. So I also have the problem of how do I take some of this out of the cloud, off the big long-haul circuits, and keep it more locally focused. That, in some cases, to us, in the overall picture, that's a better performance, better cost factor.
So you only move changes, for example, and keep
well, not just like some of it, I just put in a place where it's right next to the user. I don't need long-haul bandwidth. And for me, that becomes a mission-critical factor and can actually reduce my overall cost. So I think the other thing, anybody who's managing, and everybody here is, a complex environment, you're really going to end up using many varieties of all this. I hear a lot of people talk, well, you got to go to this one set of answers. No, it's going to be multiple answers, and some of them aren't going to be always the most modern answer or even close to the most modern answer. There's sometimes when what we're doing today is older, maybe 20 years, but it works. I mean, good classic example from the warfare side. We're still flying the B-52, and it meets mission requirements. We now have third-generation people flying the B-52. That's okay. If it works, and it works from both a mission, security, and economic standpoint, then you don't need to change it.
All right, and switching to a small agency, FCC, David, one of the, I guess, characteristics of data that the FCC has is there's a lot of information on private parties, private entities, carriers, this whole issue of the spectrum, and so you've got a lot of proprietary information that so you have an extra security need there too. What is your strategy for that set of big data versus operational for the agency type of information? Right.
So we're looking at, for all our data, how can we bake in both security and privacy protections at the code level? So when we are actually updating our applications, one example, the FCC speed test app, The FCC speed test app actually doesn't even collect your IP address. It doesn't even know who you are within a 5-mile radius. And so that actually bakes in privacy and security protections at that level, because if the data is ever compromised, there's still no way that the data could actually reveal anything. For more proprietary information that we may be collecting from partners and things like that that's sensitive, making sure that we define how the application should handle the data. And if we can define how the application should handle the data, then we also know how it shouldn't. And so that should trigger out alerts. And so one of the things we're looking at is actually how can we combine what was our network operations center with our network security operations center, because the reality is nowadays when a server reboots, that could just be the server rebooted, hardware problem, or it could be that that's now a sign of a security issue. Same thing with applications. They should actually be able to send us alerts if something that's unexpected is happening to them, so that we can have a greater degree of confidence that we're actually protecting privacy and security on the data that we're handling.
And Jack, is it possible to, in effect, virtualize the security services needed for all of this data, especially the big data, in a way that you can also reassure the public that data is being handled properly with respect to privacy and so forth?
Yeah, I think security is paramount in all these discussions, really. So it's one of the first things mentioned in almost every conversation that we have. So it's the elephant in the room, certainly, to Mr. Halverson's point about, what should you move to the cloud? Security is at the forefront of that. So that's, doing those kinds of assessments, whether it's public-facing information, things of, low risk that makes perfect sense to host in a commercial cloud type setting, or, more sensitive data, maybe not at the classified level, but personally identifiable information, all those kinds of things. All those things need to be assessed and looked at. And, in terms of what the application and the data behind the application, the security parameters for that, and whether or not a cloud service provider can meet those needs.
All right. We have so much more to discuss, but I'm afraid we're out of time. I want to thank today's guests, Terry Halverson, CIO of the Navy Department, John Montel, Electronics Records Manager in the Office of the CIO at the Interior Department, David Bray, CIO of the FCC, Jack Nichols, Solutions Architect at CDWG, and Lee Vorthman, the Chief Technology Officer for Federal Civilian Agencies at NetApp U.S. Public Sector. I'm Tom Temin, federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.
On behalf of CDWG and NetApp, thank you for joining us for this informative discussion. You'll be presented with some polling questions as you leave the webinar to help us improve future sessions. We appreciate your feedback. We'll have the archive from this session available shortly, and a link will be sent to you for you to share with your colleagues. Those of you who requested a training certificate for this webinar should receive it in the next 2 weeks. Be sure to register for upcoming webinars from WTOP, Federal News Radio, and Fed Insider. Look for upcoming sessions at www.fedinsider.com/events. This concludes today's webinar. Thank you.